Historical figure Vladimir Lenin was born as Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in the city of Simbirsk, more than 700 kilometers east of the Russian capital, Moscow, on April 22, 1870, or April 10, according to the old-style Julian calendar. Ilya Nikolaevich Ulyanov, his father, was born into a serf family in Russia in 1831. However, during his adolescence he gained his freedom and proceeded to pursue a physics and mathematics education at Kazan University. Subsequently, he established himself as a prosperous educator and public school overseer in Russia, ascending to the rank of state councillor. This elevated status resulted in the Ulyanovs becoming minor Russian nobility in the early 1880s, a recognition of Ilya's significant contributions to public education throughout the Russian Empire. Vladimir's maternal figure was Maria Alexandrovna Blank, an individual of diverse Jewish, Swedish, German, and Russian heritage. Vladimir almost certainly had no awareness of his mother's Jewish past. 2 of the 8 children that she and Ilya had collectively perished during infancy. Vladimir was born in 1866, following Anna in 1864 and Alexander, making him the 3rd eldest. Vladimir enjoyed an affluent upbringing, which was consistent with his father's burgeoning professional success. For example, while residing in a luxurious mansion in Simbirsk, the Ulyanov family also enjoyed country vacations at a manor in Kokoshkino. Vladimir, who was raised as the progeny of his father, demonstrated a remarkable intellect during his adolescence, attaining academic excellence and developing into a proficient chess player. However, his childhood idyll of the upper middle class was quickly disrupted. In January 1886, when Vladimir was 15 years old, his father succumbed to a cerebral hemorrhage and perished prematurely. This tragic event profoundly affected him, and he subsequently developed into an individual who exhibited an escalating tendency towards reactionary and defiant behavior. The circumstances significantly worsened the subsequent year when Vladimir's older brother, Alexander, who had previously departed to attend St. Petersburg State University, was implicated in a plot to assassinate Alexander III, the sovereign of the Russian Empire. For their participation in the plot, Alexander III, Vladimir's brother, and several others, were executed in the near future. This event marked the beginning of Vladimir's spiral into extremist politics in Russia, which irrevocably altered him. The subsequent actions of Vladimir, as well as those of his brother Alexander in 1887, necessitate an examination of the Russian political climate during the latter part of the 19th century. Throughout centuries, Russia had predominantly maintained a distance from the political and cultural mainstream of Europe. However, starting from the reign of Peter I in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, endeavors were undertaken to modernize and reform the nation in order to align it more closely with other European powers, including France and the Austrian Empire. His immediate successor, the German Catherine the Great, continued this endeavor in an effort to modernize Russia. During this period, the Russian Empire underwent significant expansion. By the late 18th century, Russian explorers and colonists had expanded their influence to encompass the Bering Straits, Manchuria, and the Pacific Ocean, thereby extending the Russian state to those regions. Meanwhile, in the Western Hemisphere, Catherine initiated a succession of conquests that incorporated portions of the Caucasus, Poland, and Ukraine into Russian governance. Notwithstanding this, the nation continued to lag behind in numerous aspects. The institution of serfdom, which entailed the quasi-slavery of Russian commoners and their manorial lords, continued to prevail throughout the nation. The economy remained overwhelmingly rural. The Orthodox Church exerted immense societal influence, and the country was incredibly authoritarian, governed for the self-interest of the czars and the nobility. During the 19th century, when countries such as the United States, Britain, and France were undergoing a period of modernization, the Russian Empire appeared to be lagging behind both politically and socially. Circumstances that transpired in the years preceding Vladimir's birth and throughout his teens exacerbated these problems. Alexander II assumed the throne of Russia as Tsar in 1855. His objective as a liberal reformer was to bring Russia into the 21st century. As a result, he abolished serfdom and emancipated the Russian serfs in 1861, constituting one of the most remarkable social reforms of the 19th century. He also advocated for the reform of the education system, tribunals, and police force. However, following a narrow escape from an attempted assassination in 1866, his liberal leanings diminished. However, the reforms that he had instigated in Russia had, so to say, released the genie. In a more tolerant environment, writers such as Fyodor Dostoevsky, Pyotr Kropotkin, and Mikhail Bulgakov pushed for the discussion of novel concepts and political theories, including anarchism, nihilism, and communism, while also challenging Russian society. Numerous Russians desired additional social reforms as a consequence, most notably the establishment of a parliament and the dissolution of the tsarist autocratic state. Political terrorist organizations that advocated for these changes included the Narodniks and the People's Will. The latter group achieved the assassination of Alexander II in 1881. This event marked the beginning of a more dissatisfied era, as Alexander II's son, Alexander III, opposed the reforms his father had instituted and sought to suppress liberal dissent in Russia. Consequently, the nation in which Vladimir spent his youth in the 1880s was a veritable tinderbox of political discontent and unrest. In the midst of this political climate, Vladimir matriculated at Kazan University in 1887 to initiate his academic pursuits. Almost immediately thereafter, he participated in a demonstration against the government's suppression of student organizations that were considered bastions of political opposition. Although his involvement in this incident led to a temporary arrest and expulsion from the university, it was during that time that the flames of political radicalization were kindled. In the months that followed, Vladimir commenced devouring the works of numerous European and Russian political writers. Soon thereafter, he was captivated by the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, two German political philosophers and social critics who had expressed profound disapproval of the progression of industrial society. In their seminal 1848 pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto, they advocated for the replacement of bourgeois capitalist society with one in which the industrial proletariat assumed communal ownership of all aspects of society. During a period when industrialization was advancing swiftly in Russian cities such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, and Samara, this resonated with Vladimir. Nonetheless, it was not the sole intellectual impact that shaped him during this period. His political stance was still in the process of developing, albeit undeniably radical even prior to his 20th birthday. Vladimir's mother utilized familial connections within the Russian education system in 1890 to secure examinations for him at the University of St. Petersburg as an alternative to completing his academic requirements at Kazan University. Following his triumphant graduation with first-class honors in the 1890s, he accepted a legal assistant position in Samara. During this time, he maintained his political radicalism and participated in a multitude of political organizations. The radical political climate in Russia was thriving due to the developments of 1891. Arid autumn conditions were succeeded by a sub-zero winter, with temperatures falling to or below -30 degrees Celsius in certain regions of the country along the Volga River. The subsequent arid spring and summer of 1892 contributed to widespread harvest failures throughout a significant portion of Russia. The subsequent onset of famine was exacerbated by the inept reaction of the Tsar Alexander III government and other institutions of Russian society, including the Orthodox Church. As of late 1892, when the famine subsided, more than 350,000 individuals had perished from malnutrition, while millions more were malnourished or otherwise severely affected. In Russia, radical organizations such as the Communists and Nihilists amassed ever-increasing support as opposition to the government intensified. Due to the escalating political radicalism within Russian society, Lenin experienced a sense of marginalization in the provincial city of Samara. Consequently, he departed for the capital, St. Petersburg, in 1893. During that time, He maintained his position as a legal assistant. However, his main focus was on advocating for the advancement of the Marxist and communist movements within the city. Socially revolutionary organizations like these were essentially prescribed by the government led by Alexander III. Nevertheless, his untimely demise from kidney failure in 1894 resulted in the ascension of his son Nicholas II to the throne. Although Nicholas II exhibited greater liberalism than his father, the prevailing political climate continued to be repressive. Vladimir became affiliated with a revolutionary communist cell in the city, the majority of whose members were recruited from the Technological Institute of St. Petersburg, as soon as he arrived in the capital. They adopted the name Social Democrats as a deliberate homage to the Marxist and Communist Social Democratic Party of Germany. As a rising Marxist figure who had come to the attention of the secret police in St. Petersburg by the spring of 1894, Vladimir was already under surveillance by that time. However, in the months that followed, his political stance only became more extreme, especially after he met and began a relationship with Nadezhda Krupskaya, an educator who advocated radical Marxist political views, whom he referred to as Nadia. During that period, he had additionally engaged in the clandestine distribution of Marxist tracts within the municipality. Authorities apprehended him and a number of dozen of his associates in 1895, as they were in the process of preparing to publish a communist newspaper called The Workers' Cause for this activity. After being apprehended, Lenin was denied access to legal counsel and remained in custody for more than a year prior to receiving his sentence. While incarcerated, he initiated the writing of a book titled The Development of Capitalism in Russia, which marked a turning point in his life. He was ultimately condemned to 3 years in exile in Siberia, the frigid, vast, and inhospitable region of Russia beyond the Urals, by the latter part of 1896. Although exile to Siberia did not entail incarceration, the Russian government perceived it as a viable means of eliminating a political menace from civilization due to the region's extreme isolation and sparse population. In 1898, Nadia accompanied him to that location, and the couple wed within weeks. However, due to medical complications that Nadia endured, it was decided that they would never become parents. During this period, Vladimir persisted in his writing endeavors, ultimately releasing The Development of Capitalism in Russia in 1899 under the alias Vladimir Lenin. Upon the cessation of his exile in early spring 1900, he was prevented from returning to St. Petersburg by the authorities. As a consequence, he made a temporary residence in Pskov, a municipality situated to the south of the capital. Vladimir engaged in the publication of a novel revolutionary newspaper called Iskra, which translates to The Spark. Nevertheless, he promptly discerned that persisting in his activities within Russian territory would result in his rearrest and an even more severe sentence. As a result, he departed for Switzerland in the summer of 1900, establishing connections with revolutionary organizations there prior to relocating to Munich, German Empire, in 1901, where Nadia accompanied him. During this period, he initiated his writing career using the pseudonym Lenin, with which he would later become synonymous. By 1902, he and Nadia had once more relocated to London, where Lenin remotely managed Iskra while smuggling the publication into Russia. During his exile in London during this period, Lenin authored his most renowned piece of writing, What is to be Done? In 1902. By doing so, he refuted the widely held belief among communists that the proletariat would inevitably propel society towards a socialist state prior to the establishment of a communist one. Supporters of this perspective asserted that communist parties merely served to facilitate this process. Lenin, on the contrary, maintained that even overt armed conflict was necessary to guarantee the triumph of communism over capitalism. He advocated for a more interventionist stance. His conviction was that while the working conditions of the proletariat and other determinants did increase workers' desire for a socialist state in nations such as Russia, Germany, and Britain, they could not progress towards socialism and then communism without the leadership of a revolutionary movement. Lenin believed that once this was accomplished in a single nation, the state would propel the global communist movement. Thus, Lenin came to regard the Russian communist movement as the vanguard of the proletariat, a movement that would eventually inspire the Russian and European proletariats to embrace communism. However, this perspective also posed a risk. Should the communist parties in Russia be held accountable for the domestic and global communist movements, then certainly every action undertaken by the Russian communist movement could be rationalized as essential for the advancement of international communism as a whole. Lenin also participated in one of the pivotal moments in the early annals of the Russian communist movement while in London. During Lenin's exile in Siberia in 1898, the various revolutionary cells and organizations that comprised Russian communism coalesced in March 1898 to create the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, or RSDLP. This coalition was established at an underground conference in the city of Minsk. Within months of its formation, the Russian secret police, the Okhrana, began to target the party, and several of its leaders were detained and imprisoned. As a consequence, a resolution was reached to conduct the Second Party Congress of the RSDLP overseas in 1903. Nevertheless, as soon as the delegates convened in an August chapel on Tottenham Court Road in London, divisions began to emerge. A faction under the leadership of Julius Martov argued that party membership should be kept broad to appeal to the greatest number of people feasible in Russia, where industrial workers still comprised only 3% of the population. Nevertheless, an opposing faction, led by Lenin in a short period of time, maintained that membership should be limited to more dedicated revolutionaries. In November, a vote was conducted regarding the subject, and the party divided in half. Following Lenin's leadership, his faction was dubbed the Bolsheviks, while the opposing faction was dubbed the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks, despite being the lesser faction, were not easily confused with the terms majority and minority, Menshevik and Bolshevik, respectively. This contradiction arose from the fact that a majority of the editorial board of Iskra voted in support of Lenin's faction. The immediate separation of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks did not lead to the formation of two independent political parties. Instead, these evolved into two factions that functioned within the RSDLP. However, a profound animosity existed between them, which was exacerbated by Lenin's publication of a treatise titled One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, in the summer of 1904, a vehement critique of the Mensheviks. As a result of the effectiveness of these maneuvers, the Bolsheviks had taken control of the RSDLP Central Committee by early 1905. The scheduling was opportune, given that significant occurrences were taking place in Russia during the initial months of 1905. A procession of several thousand unarmed laborers marched peacefully past the Tsar's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg on January 22 of that year, with the purpose of presenting a petition advocating for enhanced labor rights in Russian manufacturing facilities. On what became known as Bloody Sunday, government forces retaliated violently against the protesters, resulting in the fatalities of more than 150 individuals and the injuries of hundreds more. This, coupled with Russia's humiliation in the Russo-Japanese War, sparked a nationwide revolution in Russia in 1905, characterized by agrarian discontent in the countryside, worker strikes in numerous cities, and army mutinies. Motivated by the revolution of 1905, Lenin made his long-awaited return to Russia after a 5-year absence. He quickly arrived in St. Petersburg, where he played a pivotal role in the formation of Novaya Zhizn, which translates to New Life, a new communist publication. By means of this and his other writings, he espoused the case for the RSDLP to endeavor to increase its membership during this period of fervent revolution in Russia. However, the party had already missed the opportunity. Nicholas II, the Tsar, promulgated the October Manifesto in October 1905. By doing so, he achieved extensive concessions to the numerous protesters dispersed across Russia. The manifesto additionally pledged the granting of numerous civil rights that had been established in other European countries since the 18th century to Russian citizens. Furthermore, It assured the formation of a novel Russian parliament called the Duma and the establishment of political parties to elect members to this legislative body. Despite the fact that this resulted in the resolution of the political crisis and the conclusion of the 1905 revolution, Nicholas subsequently walked back on the majority of his commitments. Nicholas dissolved the First State Duma, which had been elected in 1906, on the grounds that its membership had become excessively radical. Subsequent Duma were ineffectual and conservative government organs. In the interim, martial law was swiftly instituted in 1906, and in the years that followed, political dissent was repressed throughout Russia. In 1906 and 1907, as the political repression intensified, Lenin and the Bolsheviks deliberated on their alternatives. It was evident that the revolution of 1905 had been a false dawn. Then, what was the course of action? A faction, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, an ascendant figure in the Georgian branch of the communist movement, proposed executing a terror campaign consisting of attacks on state institutions. This scheme would additionally contribute to the financial support of the RSDLP. This had a limited number of supporters, including Lenin, who did not completely oppose it. Early in 1906, he crossed the border into the Grand Duchy of Finland, a constituent part of the Russian Empire that was governed with some degree of autonomy, in response to the crackdown. In 1906, the Bolsheviks enjoyed a period of operational autonomy in this region, as they could conveniently transport their printed materials to St. Petersburg and Moscow via the frontier with Finland. Later, however, it became clear that a reversion to the strategies utilized from 1900 to 1905 would be necessary. Once more, the leaders of the RSDLP would seek refuge in Western nations such as Britain, which offered greater tolerance towards their activities compared to the autocratic East. Lenin had returned to London by 1907, where the Bolsheviks had triumphantly re-established authority over the RSDLP at the party's Fifth Congress, which was convened that summer, in opposition to the Menshevik faction. Following this, a resolution was reached to transfer the party's main office to Paris, a destination that Lenin and Nadia had already reached by the conclusion of 1908 as nomadic revolutionaries in a never-ending pursuit. However, this did not occur until Lenin had devoted a number of months to research at the British Museum in London during the summer of 1908. This work subsequently formed the foundation of his book Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. The subsequent relocation to Paris was also temporary, and Lenin spent the subsequent several years in Stockholm, Copenhagen, Prague, and Krakow, for brief periods of time, on average. During this period, his influence with the RSDLP appeared to diminish, as factions within the party advocated for a return to parliamentary politics in Russia. This was despite the fact that the State Duma, which Tsar Nicholas II had instituted in 1905 as a sham to appear as though parliamentary representation had been granted in Russia. Furthermore, his health and that of Nadia were both deteriorating. Lenin likely experienced the initial phases of acute atherosclerosis, a pathological condition characterized by an atypical accumulation of cholesterol and fat on the arterial walls. However, certain individuals have postulated that his health complications might have originated from neurosyphilis. Regardless of the precise origin of his malady, it began to give rise to significant challenges throughout his years of exile, as his prominence declined within the Russian communist movement. Concurrently, in 1912, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks formally separated into two distinct political organizations, solidifying their division. The Russian communist movement and Lenin's chance to re-establish their leadership positions within the Bolshevik Party and reignite their cause coincided in the most peculiar of ways, the outbreak of a European war. A multitude of issues, including the German Empire's ascent as a challenge to British supremacy, colonial rivalries among all the major powers in the scramble for Africa and a similar scramble for Asia, and regional tensions stemming from the Ottoman Empire's decline in the Balkans after centuries of dominance, had contributed to years of escalating tensions among the major European powers. Regarding the latter matter, which involved competition with the Austro-Hungarian Empire to supplant the Turks as the preeminent regional power, Russia was especially concerned. Thus, a regional crisis that emerged in that country during the summer of 1914 rapidly escalated into a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Russia. The British and French, in support of their Russian ally, declared war on the administrations of Berlin and Vienna shortly after Germany's accession to Austria-Hungary. With this, the First World War began. By its conclusion, Russia would have undergone a profound transformation. During the concluding days of July 1914, Lenin was in Galicia, a region that at the turn of the 20th century was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and now shares borders with Ukraine and Poland. Due to his Russian citizenship, he was briefly imprisoned by the Austro-Hungarian authorities. However, he quickly demonstrated his non-allegiance to the tsarist regime of Nicholas II and was consequently freed. He and Nadia then spent the next 2 years in neutral Switzerland, amidst the ongoing conflict in Europe. He continued to compose and theorize at that location in 1917, when he published Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. As the 1910s approached, Lenin's political ideology was already maturing, and he exhibited a greater willingness than the majority of communist ideologues to depart from orthodox Marxism. Marx's notion that a society could only transition to a socialist revolution and then communism after a gradual transition from autocracy characterized by monarchs and emperors to bourgeois democracy governed by the middle and upper classes was vehemently rejected by him. Lenin, cognizant of the fact that bourgeois democracy had not yet emerged in Russia, postulated in Switzerland during the middle of the 1910s that a state could transition directly from autocracy to socialist revolution, thereby bypassing the process of bourgeois democratic development. An endeavor of this nature would subsequently be undertaken in Russia. In the tranquil Alpine region, Lenin's political philosophy was undergoing development while Russia's war effort progressed abysmally. The Russian army encountered the most formidable military forces in the world on the eastern front of the German Imperial Army, despite being inadequately commanded and trained. Complicating the situation further was the decision of Tsar Nicholas II to assume personal command of the army. The year 1916 witnessed significant Russian advancements, most notably the seizure of vast territories in Poland during the Brusilov offensive. Romania's involvement in the conflict on the side of Britain, France, and Russia also aided the Russian war effort in the Balkans. Nevertheless, social unrest and food shortages escalated within Russia by the end of the year, as the conflict crippled supply lines and caused scarcity everywhere. The Tsarist government was experiencing unprecedented discontentment due to apprehensions regarding the sway it had over the imperial family through Grigory Rasputin, a self-proclaimed religious man and mystic. Subsequently, on February 23, 1917, widespread demonstrations broke out in St. Petersburg, which had been rechristened Petrograd in 1914, followed by additional cities across Russia. The following week, the Tsarist government progressively relinquished authority over the nation, and by early March, it became evident that the military no longer possessed the resolve to intervene decisively in order to rescue Nicholas II. As he attempted to return to the capital from the Eastern Front, he encountered hostile forces and his family was encircled in Petrograd. Ultimately, the Tsar heeded the Council of Army Chiefs and several senior members of the Duma and abdicated the throne. After 3 centuries of dominion over Russia, the Romanov dynasty came to an abrupt halt with the February Revolution. Soon after arriving in Switzerland, Lenin was informed of the situation back home. He was making preparations to return to Russia after many more years in exile within days. His resurgence of influence within the Bolshevik movement during the war was due to his position that the communist movement ought to abstain from involvement and instead denounce the conflict as a confrontation between imperialist and capitalist regimes. The German government assisted Lenin in his endeavors to return to Russia by arranging for him and several dozen other Russian dissidents to travel via a sealed train from the Swiss-German border to the North Sea. This action was taken in the belief that Lenin would disrupt Russian politics and potentially contribute to the German war effort on the Eastern Front. The organization had arrived at the Baltic Sea by March, at which point they proceeded to neutral Sweden via ferry before continuing northward via land via Sweden and Finland. They were provided with progress reports regarding the situation in Petrograd, where a provisional government had been established by the State Duma. This government appeared to be predominantly controlled by a coalition of centrist revolutionaries and the liberal aristocracy. However, this nascent regime encountered immediate difficulties when the Russian lines along the Eastern Front physically crumbled due to increasing desertions and a dearth of effective leadership. Therefore, by the time Lenin's train arrived in Petrograd on April 16, 1917, the nascent regime was already beset by challenges. Upon returning to Russia, he promptly initiated efforts to advance the Bolshevik cause. During the late spring and early summer, he addressed sizable assemblies of proletarian laborers in the city and distributed the April Theses, a document he had drafted advocating for a new government predicated on workers' councils known as the Soviets. In the weeks that followed, tensions escalated until they reached their zenith in mid-July. This period has since been dubbed the July Days, and it was characterized by workers and soldiers participating in violent protests against the government, which were incited by Bolshevik agitation. Following the July Days, the provisional government implemented measures to stifle the Bolsheviks, while Lenin and a significant number of his adherents retreated to the semi-autonomous Grand Duchy of Finland across the border. Additional prominent party members, including burgeoning theorist and organizer Leon Trotsky, were apprehended in Petrograd. Early in the autumn of 1917, Lenin and his adherents initiated preparations for a new counter-revolution in Russia with the objective of toppling the provisional government from Helsinki. Similar schemes were being devised by factions within the Russian Navy and Army to undermine the provisional government, which was essentially operating on borrowed time due to its inadequate management of the conflict and inability to restore stability to the country's affairs. As the autumn progressed, the political climate in Russia remained tense, with General Lava Kornilov, the commander-in-chief of the Russian military, attempting a military seizure. To quell this, the provisional government was compelled to seek assistance from the communists and their workers' Soviets in Petrograd. This development bolstered the Bolsheviks' cause. Early in October, Lenin successfully traversed the frontier and returned to the capital, where he discovered that Leon Trotsky had been elected leader of the Petrograd Soviet. At this juncture, the Bolsheviks had successfully besieged the Mensheviks, their adversaries within the Russian Communist movement. Since March, the latter had established a more substantial presence in the State Duma and had exhibited greater cooperation with the provisional government. In contrast, the Bolsheviks had been progressively able to exploit their steadfastly unyielding stance since the turn of the 20th century. Thus, by the time Lenin returned to Petrograd in October, the conditions were completely favorable for the Bolsheviks to attempt a permanent takeover of power in Russia. The coup that transpired in Petrograd on November 7, 1917, or October 25, 1917 according to the Julian calendar in use by Russia at the time, was a turning point in 20th century global history. The communist movement subsequently hailed it as the October Revolution. It was the result of weeks of preparations that Lenin, Trotsky, and others began in early and mid-October in Petrograd. In Moscow, Petrograd, and other cities, armed militias were organized in preparation for an uprising against the government. The fact that the provisional government was cognizant of the movement's plans but was unable to halt them, despite its best efforts to effectively evacuate the city of Petrograd on October 24 in an effort to prevent a second revolution, demonstrates the movement's immense strength. In response, Lenin and Trotsky issued an appeal for the Military Revolutionary Committee and the Soviet Union to take control of government buildings on October 25. The majority of Moscow and Petrograd were under Bolshevik control by day's end. The Bolshevik Red Guards, the Revolutionary Soldiers designation, stormed into the Winter Palace in Petrograd the following day, thereby overthrowing the provisional government. That evening, in Petrograd, a Congress of the Soviets, the Workers' Councils of Russia, was convened. Its proceedings concluded on October 27, with the proclamation of a new socialist administration. Early discussions of a communist state were restrained so as not to alienate the majority of the Russian populace, the majority of whom were still engaged in agrarian agricultural labor. However, by late October 1917, the establishment of such a state had been practically completed. The revolutionaries swiftly disseminated a portion of their perspectives and motives to the broader political community throughout Russia within days. This was a polyglot empire that extended from the Pacific Ocean in the south and the Baltic Sea in Europe to the Arctic Circle and the deserts of Central Asia in the south. The region beyond the Urals mountains of Siberia was inhabited by a diverse assemblage of ethnic groups, including Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Georgians, Finns, Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Moldovans, Kazakhs, Turkmens, Armenians, and numerous others. The principle of ensuring that the newly formed government would administer Russia for the entire population was reflected in the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia, which was published on November 2, 1917, shortly after the Bolsheviks took control of Petrograd. This established that all ethnic groups residing within the jurisdiction of Russia were sovereign, equal, and entitled to exercise their right to self-determination. In accordance with Marxist ideology, religious and national privileges were also eliminated. The document, endorsed by Lenin and Joseph Stalin, a prominent figure in the Bolshevik movement ever since his initial appearance during the Revolution of 1905, stands as a remarkable testament to the revolutionary ideals that characterized the Bolshevik movement from its inception. In essence, the declaration declared an end to the imperialism that had previously defined the Russian Empire. The political future of the subjects under the Tsars was within their control. The regime of communism would begin to utterly renege on this pledge within months. The October Revolution did not inherently lead to the establishment of a one-party state. Prior to the revolution, the provisional government had been making arrangements to conduct elections in order to establish a new constituent assembly. In early 1918, the Bolsheviks executed this plan. Indeed, the Russian revolutionary movement encompassed additional factions that aspired to authority, most notably the Mensheviks and various Marxist and revolutionary organizations. As a consequence, a Russian Constituent Assembly convened in January 1918. However, its agenda was swiftly eclipsed by the Bolsheviks' March 1918 formal rebranding as the Russian Communist Party and their pursuit of absolute power. In the months that followed, actual power was increasingly vested in the workers' councils or Soviets in cities such as Moscow and Petrograd, while the political bureau or Politburo of the Russian Communist Party monopolized centralized power. Simultaneously, the party initiated a focused campaign to expel Mensheviks and individuals affiliated with other revolutionary and socialist organizations from Soviet institutions and other political organizations. Thus, by the end of 1918, the Russian Communist Party had successfully established and maintained authority over a one-party state in Russia. Throughout this pivotal year, Lenin emerged as the leader of the nascent communist state. Primarily, he presided over Sovnarkom, the Council of People's Commissars that, on behalf of the Russian Communist Party, effectively supervised the governance of the Soviets or workers' councils across Russia. Following this, it would emerge as a primary executive branch of the government that was gradually transforming into the Soviet Union. The titles and responsibilities of the Sovnarkom presidents, who would later become the official heads of state, were still in the process of developing in 1918. Lenin had the distinction of preside over Sovnarkom, in addition to serving on the Politburo, Council of Labor, and Defense. Therefore, upon Lenin's relocation to the Kremlin in Moscow, which had been the historical seat of power until Tsar Peter I transferred the capital to St. Petersburg in the early 18th century, he did so in the preeminent position possible within the nascent communist regime. Despite this, there was a price to pay. In 1918, while the political climate remained extremely unstable, he was the target of 3 severe attempts on his life. On August 30, 1918, during the morning of the third assassination attempt, Lenin was severely wounded and shot twice, with blood entering his lungs. Subsequently, his health, which had been precarious for years, deteriorated precipitously. Simultaneously with the establishment of a Soviet-led state governed by the Politburo, Sovnarkom, and the people, the Communist Party initiated a series of significant economic reforms in 1918 that were consistent with Marxist ideology. The new government issued its first decree on land on November 8, 1917, which was less than 2 weeks subsequent to the October Revolution. This decree proclaimed that the state had seized all land throughout Russia that was formerly possessed by the Russian nobility and the Orthodox Church. It was to be immediately redistributed among the peasantry in accordance with the principles of communism. Subsequently, Lenin and others would participate in a discussion regarding the type of agricultural policy that ought to be implemented. Although Lenin advocated for the establishment of state-run vast collective farms, this matter remained unresolved for a considerable period of time. Significant factories and industries in the cities were likewise nationalized, and the Soviet Union effectively gained control of them through the implementation of the new ownership structure. In addition, new regulations were implemented to reform the labor laws. As an illustration, the working day was restricted to 8 hours, which can be considered a remarkably progressive resolution considering that laborers in numerous European nations, including Britain and Germany, had been advocating for decades for a gradual reduction from 14 to 12 hours per day. Concurrent with the aforementioned economic and property reforms, Lenin's government enacted an extensive series of laws in late 1917 and 1918 with the intention of revolutionizing Russia's social and legal environment. An example of an ideology that shunned religion is communism. As a consequence, the newly formed government issued an order in January 1918 mandating the immediate separation of religion and state, a period when organized Christian churches continued to exert significant influence over education and other social issues throughout Europe. Simultaneously, the emerging communist state entered the breach and initiated universal free education. Early in the 20th century, in a country like Russia, where only a minute percentage of the population had access to a comprehensive education, this was a significant development, and a campaign was also launched to combat the pervasive issue of illiteracy. In addition to banking, transportation, trade, and communications, additional facets of Russian existence were rapidly incorporated into state control. Moreover, the antiquated tsarist legal system was swiftly superseded by a system officiated over by people's courts. In contrast to the majority of judicial systems in Europe, common law courts in Britain were officiated over by a combination of a judge and 2 people's assessors. Similar to jurors in the common law system, but endowed with more authority, they were permitted to render decisions in cases in conjunction with the magistrate. Obviously, despite these social and economic reforms, there was still a conflict to be resolved. The year 1917 was dreadful for the Russian military campaign along the Eastern Front. As a result of widespread desertion and the reluctance of numerous Russian military commanders to fight for the provisional government that followed the February Revolution and initially the Tsarist regime, the German Empire advanced along a broad front extending from the southeast of Poland to the Baltic Sea. Lenin's government expeditiously recognized that a territorial loss was inevitable if it wished to extract Russia from the conflict. Consequently, it initiated negotiations with Berlin almost immediately in an effort to end Russian participation in what Lenin had consistently denounced as an imperialist and capitalist conflict. 4 months after the October Revolution, on March 3, 1918, Russia and the Central Powers, headed by Germany, formally ratified the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia essentially renounced control over all of its territories in the Baltic States region, Poland, and Ukraine in accordance with the parameters of the agreement. A significant portion of Russian territory in Poland was annexed by Germany, whereas the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were incorporated as vassal states of Germany. Finland, like a new Ukrainian state, attained its independence. Additionally, in the southeast, Russia transferred territory to the Ottoman Empire, an ally of Germany. some of the most densely populated regions of the Russian Empire, in addition to a vast quantity of its most fertile agricultural territory and industrial cities, were confiscated as part of this incredibly punitive peace accord. However, by consenting to it, the emerging communist state effectively withdrew from the conflict with Germany so that it could focus on strengthening its authority over Russia. In the spring of 1918, Lenin's government was in dire need of peace with Germany and the other Central Powers, as the revolution they had instigated in October 1917 had encountered significant opposition from various factions within Russia and a civil war was erupting throughout the country. In contrast to the Red Army of the Soviet regime, the White Army was the principal adversary of the new regime. However, the term «whites» referred to an extremely broad coalition of counter-revolutionaries who were resistant to accepting the new regime. Significant portions of the ancient Russian aristocracy and the Orthodox Church were among them. Both were abruptly deprived of the immense wealth and influence they had amassed in Russia for centuries. Other factions within the Russian army and navy that were resistant to the communist takeover, as well as centrists and leftists who favored the counter-revolution when it became evident that the Bolsheviks would monopolize power and that Lenin's Russia would not practice democratic communism, comprised additional white factions. By the spring and summer of 1918, this unconventional alliance of anti-Bolsheviks had captured substantial portions of Russia. For Lenin's government, the early phases of the Russian Civil War were challenging. This was the result of occurrences in other locations. By the late autumn of 1918, internal strife had begun in Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, signaling the end of the First World War. The conflict ultimately concluded on November 11, 1918, with Germany surrendering. By that time, Kaiser Wilhelm II had vacated his throne. Following the conclusion of the broader international conflict, the victorious powers, most notably Britain, but also France, the United States, and Japan, became intent on bringing about the demise of the nascent communist state in Russia. In late 1918, Britain and other great powers commenced providing the White Army with tremendous resources in an effort to prevent a radical socialist government from coming to power in one of the most powerful states in Europe. This decision was made by the great powers in London and Paris. Expeditionary forces were also deployed to Russia by Britain and other nations, while Poland, a nation recently established subsequent to Germany's defeat, engaged in hostilities with Russia with assistance from the West. Due to this, Lenin's government endured a tumultuous start to the Civil War in 1918 and 1919, and for a period of time, it appeared that the fledgling regime might not endure for much longer. When analyzing the initial stages of development of the Soviet state in 1918 and 1919, it is crucial to consider the enormous crisis that befell that nascent nation. In order to maintain control over the territory that remained under Soviet control, Lenin and his closest associates, including Trotsky and Stalin, resorted to the use of state terror in response to multiple threats to their very existence. This was in progress since December 1917, when Lenin issued the Emergency Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage in order to establish the commission. The first of a series of exceedingly potent covert police agencies established by the Soviet state during its 74-year existence, it is more commonly referred to as the Cheka. It was the responsibility of the Cheka to eliminate anyone considered a counter-revolutionary or state enemy. Its commander, Felix Dzerzhinsky, was endowed with extensive authority in order to accomplish this mission. Hundreds, and then thousands, of individuals deemed to be adversaries of the state were apprehended and executed without due process within weeks. Numerous individuals were apprehended and subsequently transported to forced labor stations that were being established in the harsh and remote regions of Siberia. Although Lenin endeavored to establish a personal distance from the events that would later be referred to as the Red Terror, it is indisputable that he presided over the Soviet Union during a period when the most heinous aspects of the tsarist regime were resurrected to establish the framework for a security state that would define Soviet Russia for the subsequent 7 decades. The Red Terror constituted merely one component of the ruthless strategies implemented by the emerging Soviet state to combat the civil war and maintain regime stability. Additionally, blockade units were utilized in the war effort. Leon Trotsky conceived of these, which entailed the deployment of Red Army elements behind the Soviet front lines to engage in gunfire against any Soviet soldiers attempting to retreat. Despite their brutality, these methods quickly demonstrated their efficacy. During the summer and autumn of 1918, the war effort encountered its lowest point. A British and French expeditionary force arrived at Archangel on the White Sea prior to the conclusion of the war against Germany. A legion of Czech and Slovak soldiers, having advanced extensively into Russia, seized the city of Kazan. Additionally, the Japanese attacked Vladivostok, the principal port in the east. Effectively mobilizing the Red Army ensued thereafter under Trotsky. In September 1918, Kazan was recaptured, and in October 1918, Samara was captured as well. In November, however, the newly independent Poland declared war, offsetting these efforts. However, the initial assault launched in 1918 by Western powers and their auxiliaries was unsuccessful in subduing the communist state, and the conclusion of the First World War caused the Entente powers to divert their attention due to the outbreak of conflicts in Turkey, Ireland, and other regions. The Red Army launched an offensive in 1919. Kiev was besieged at the beginning of February as the Communists re-established their authority over Ukraine, which they had relinquished with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. British, French, and American forces in Ukraine were compelled to withdraw from the region by April due to the Russian conquest of the port of Odessa and the establishment of communist authority over Ukraine. The British and French expeditionary forces stationed in the northern region along the White Sea, encircling Arkhangelsk and Murmansk, were withdrawn in August. Following that, the Western powers were predominantly relegated to engaging in indirect conflict with the Soviet Union via their auxiliaries in the White Army, Poland, and certain neighboring countries of Russia. However, a symbolic presence by the United States and Japan persisted in the far eastern region of the country. In the meantime, the Western theater of war was preoccupied with the conflict between Russia and Poland. Initially, the Poles made significant progress, seizing Kiev in early 1920. However, an armistice was reached in the autumn of that year, following a Soviet counteroffensive that threatened Warsaw. Thus, Lenin's regime had essentially won the Russian Civil War by the end of 1920. However, mopping up operations persisted in a number of locations until October 1922, when the port of Vladivostok was recaptured, effectively ending the conflict. During the American Civil War, Lenin delegated Red Army leadership to others, notably Trotsky. Conversely, he devoted the latter part of the 1910s to devising a novel strategy concerning global socialism and communism. This was in response to the British Labour Party's 1918 demands for the Labour and Socialist International, a new international conference of socialist parties. However, during his years in exile, the Russian leader had grown weary of the more moderate socialist movements that dominated Western Europe. Instead, he was determined to found a new international socialist movement under the leadership of the Soviet Union. As a result, the First Congress of the Communist International, commonly referred to as the Comintern, was convened in Moscow in March 1919. At this time, there was considerable optimism regarding the potential for a global socialist revolution, considering that communist uprisings had transpired in Hungary and Germany in the weeks leading up to the First Comintern. However, these were swiftly quelled, and Lenin must have realized in his later years that the international capitalist system could not be overthrown immediately. However, despite this, the formation of the Comintern was of the utmost importance, as it would later function as a primary instrument of Soviet-led global communism. An additional policy implemented by the Leninist Soviet regime merits consideration. As the American Civil War approached its conclusion in the spring of 1921, the leader of the Soviet Union issued the new economic policy. This circumstance constituted a degree of deviation for Lenin, an individual who had consistently adhered to the Marxist ideology. Many at the time might have been taken aback when he described a novel economic framework that would permit a limited continuation of the capitalist free market in Russia for the foreseeable future. It was officially sanctioned for Russian citizens to possess modest quantities of land and enterprises, while significant industrial and agricultural estates continued to be owned by the government. The new economic policy was implemented with the dual objectives of restoring stability to the Russian economy following the war and stimulating development during the most severe famine since 1891 and 1892, which had swept the nation. In the end, the Russian economy received a significant boost from the new economic policy as it emerged victorious in the conflict and demonstrated the advantages of permitting free trade and private ownership to continue, albeit in a restricted capacity. Through the 1920s, however, the new economic policy was progressively abandoned due to the intensification of state administration of industry and farm collectivization. The pivotal shift towards embracing the new economic policy during the early 1920s naturally prompts inquiries regarding the comprehensive understanding of Lenin's political philosophy. In the end, this represented a departure of sorts from traditional Marxism. However, Lenin had been agnostic to the writings of the German political theorist of the 19th century for a considerable period of time. By the 1920s, Leninism had evolved into its own distinct school of communist thought, which continued to exert an influence on communist regimes worldwide for the remainder of the 20th century. Fundamentally, Leninism posited that the establishment of a capitalist system and bourgeois democracy was not a prerequisite for a socialist revolution. Rather, it advocated for the formation of a sizable urban proletariat capable of executing the socialist revolution and eventually establishing a communist state. Conversely, Lenin advocated for the establishment of a proletariat dictatorship, irrespective of its scale within a given state, and further argued that this vanguard party of the proletariat would guide the remainder of society in the direction of socialism and communism. It was a significant development. Marx would have disapproved of the notion of communism emerging in regions devoid of industrialization, let alone a sizable urban proletariat, such as China, Mongolia, or Angola. However, Leninism, which advocated for a small vanguard of the proletariat to lead any nation to communism, would significantly influence the 20th century. However, Lenin would not survive to witness any of this. Throughout the 1910s, his health had been deteriorating consistently, but the precise cause of his ailment has never been determined with certainty. Subsequent to the numerous assassination attempts in 1918, specifically the autumn in which he was shot twice and severely wounded, his condition deteriorated considerably. His physicians, of which dozens were summoned in an attempt to resolve his issues in the late 1910s and early 1920s, subsequently concluded that he may have been poisoned by blood due to the fact that the bullets from this most serious assassination attempt had never been extracted from his body. In April 1922, he ultimately underwent surgery to have them surgically removed. However, the procedure was unsuccessful in achieving any amelioration. During the early 1920s, his mobility was progressively limited to Moscow due to an atypical confluence of symptoms, which comprised general fatigue, migraines, insomnia, sensitivity to sound and other stimuli, and headaches. The culmination of this occurred in the summer of 1922, when he experienced the initial of multiple strokes within a matter of months. His condition resulted in progressive paralysis and eventual dependence on a wheelchair. Amid the rapid deterioration of Lenin's health during the early 1920s, considerations inevitably shifted towards succession planning and potential measures that could be implemented in the event of his demise or complete incapacity to govern the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR as it had been formally designated in 1922. Despite never having officially declared himself a dictator, Lenin had risen to the preeminent position within the Soviet state due to his intellectual leadership and extensive imprisonment. Thus, it was plausible that the Soviet Union would be governed collectively by the Politburo and that he would not be succeeded. However, not even Lenin was convinced that such a scheme could succeed. He held the belief that a figure of prominence would take his place. With this objective in mind, He dictated his final testament during the winter of 1922, despite being unwell. He described the qualities of the viable candidates in this section. Primarily among them was Joseph Stalin, who had attained the rank of General Secretary of the Communist Party by that time. During the 1905 revolution, however, Lenin had developed a skepticism towards the Georgian he had first encountered 17 years prior, asserting that he was intellectually unprepared and excessively ambitious. In lieu of this, Lenin authorized the ascension of Leon Trotsky to his position. Testament dictation constituted one of his final significant acts of clarity of mind. Lenin experienced another stroke in March 1923, which led to his complete paralysis from speech. Following that, his condition deteriorated further until he entered a coma in the early weeks of 1924. His demise occurred on January 21. Political maneuverings to supplant Lenin commenced without delay. Trotsky was recuperating from a medical condition while residing in the Caucasus region, where the temperature was higher, when Lenin passed away. Due to inaccurate funeral arrangements sent to him by Stalin, Trotsky was unable to attend the state memorial that took place in Moscow on January 27. Following this, Lenin's remains were embalmed and exhibited publicly in a mausoleum situated in Red Square, central Moscow, where they remain visible a century later. Following Lenin's death, many senior members of the Soviet administration and the Politburo favored Stalin, notwithstanding Lenin's admonitions to the contrary. Stalin formed a political alliance with Lev Kamenev and Grigory Zinoviev, two prominent members of the Politburo, with the intention of undermining Trotsky in the years that ensued. Subsequently, he exiled him and reverted against his former allies. By 1929, Stalin had entirely consolidated power and solidified his dictatorial position in a way that Lenin had yet to achieve. He governed the Soviet Union totalitarian for the following quarter century, committing the murder of millions in an effort to maintain absolute power. Born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, the individual who adopted the alias Lenin in the early 1900s and rose to prominence under that identity, was among the most influential individuals of the 20th century. Early in his youth, he exhibited violent discontentment with his bourgeois upper-middle-class upbringing. This transformation was prompted in part by the execution of his brother by the autocratic tsarist regime in the late 1880s. During the subsequent quarter century, he established himself as the preeminent intellectual voice within the Bolshevik movement, developing theories regarding the operational mechanisms of communism in Russia while surpassing the conceptual boundaries of Karl Marx. Subsequently, in 1917, when the conditions improved for the establishment of a communist state in Russia due to the First World War, he ascended to its throne, proclaiming that the Russian proletariat and the communists, however few in number they may have been relative to the total population of the Russian Empire, would serve as a model for the global spread of communism. The Russian Revolution originated from a sense of idealistic sentiment and the objective of toppling the centuries-long autocratic imperial regime that had dominated Russia. However, complete evasion of one's past is uncommon for nation-states, and Soviet Russia undoubtedly understood this. As soon as the Bolsheviks seized power, they initiated the establishment of a communist state that resembled the tsarist regime in many respects. The Cheka was established as an effective successor to the Okhrana, the secret police that operated during the tsarist era. Political dissidents were subsequently exiled to Siberian labor camps and camps, much as they had been during the Persian Empire. Furthermore, the notion of establishing a democratic legislative assembly in a nascent communist state was swiftly thwarted by the establishment of the Soviet Union's dictatorship and the Politburo, which was led by Lenin. This quickly prompted severe disapproval from other communist leaders in Europe and Russia, including the leader of the German Revolution, Rosa Luxemburg, and the intellectual progenitor of Bolshevism, Peter Kropotkin. It is important to clarify that Lenin was not the same as Joseph Stalin. However, it was his establishment of a highly totalitarian state in the late 1910s and early 1920s that facilitated Stalin's ascent to power more than anyone else. What is your assessment of Lenin? Had he lived longer, Could a more amicable Soviet Union have emerged? Or could he have potentially transformed into an oppressive and totalitarian regime similar to that which Stalin later underwent? Kindly provide your feedback in the remarks section. Until then, we appreciate your attention.